Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ashley, and I manage Financial Narrative. Happy to see you all here today. Today, we're going to talk about thriving through crisis and really creating communication plans ahead of unexpected events, as well as how you manage through those unexpected events. We've got some great panelists who are going to be talking with us today. And now I will welcome our speakers onto the stage. Amber is our host, and she will kick us off. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you, Ashley. Excited to be here today. I'll give myself a brief intro and then I'll bring our panelist in. I'm an integrated communications consultant at Vested. I work directly with senior stakeholders at financial services companies on building and managing their reputations. I started my career more than 20 years ago at a crisis communications consultancy. So I had the opportunity to work with Fortune 500 brands on crisis and issues management. Today, as Ashley mentioned, our panel of experts are going to be discussing the experiences they've had in crisis and special situations. We're going to share some of our best practices and also our playbook for reputation management, even in times when there isn't a crisis. So I'd love to pass it to my panelists, if we can bring them in. First, Candice, if you could intro yourself, and also it'd be great to share perhaps one of your key learnings in the times that you've been working in crisis.
Thanks, Amber. I'm really happy to be here today with everyone. So I head up corporate communications North America at Janus, Henderson, which I started this role last year. Before that, I was at Credit Suisse for almost 7 years in New York and in Hong Kong, where I led corporate communications for their investment bank division globally, as well as our asset management business in Americas. Obviously, during that time at Credit Suisse in particular, there was no shortage of kind of crisis communications that I had to kind of field during that time. I think one of the major kind of learnings from that is just to keep coordination across different regions, different markets, across the media. And that was something that was critical. And I'm looking forward to talking to everyone today.
Wonderful. And I'd like to welcome Jen as well.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever everyone is listening from. My name is Jen Rosenthal. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I lead communications and public affairs for Grayscale Investments. We're the world's largest crypto asset manager. And before I came to Grayscale, I was in-house at global companies, but also as a communications consultant, working with Fortune 500 companies and executives on all different types of fun situations and scenarios. I think one of the things that I have just learned over the course of my career is it's best to over-prepare so you don't overreact. So, for me, crisis preparation is so important, and I'm really excited to dig into that topic today.
We're going to talk a lot about preparation. Thanks, Jen. And our final panelist, Stephen.
Hi, how are you? Great to be here today. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone, for having us. His name again is Stephen Mauskopf, managing partner of Clear Marque. We are a reputation management firm focused solely on the digital side. That would be in particular in search and Wikipedia. I've been in this industry for about 11 plus years at this point. It's a fairly young industry when we talk about solely focusing on digital. And we've seen pretty much everything out there until we see the next scenario. But we've pretty much have seen everything. We've worked with Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies as well, small, medium, large companies, individuals, executives, and pretty much anyone else you can possibly think of. We've dealt with crisis situations. We also deal with just brand alignment situations, I guess, which we'll get into a little bit more. That would be more of a preparedness type of a situation. Because really, in the end of the day, it's all really one. I guess one of the most important things that I would say in my experiences would be understanding that nothing negative ever goes away online by itself. It does require action at some level, whether you want that action to be minimal or not. But there's definitely something required on the side of the company or the individual. And I would say another very big misunderstanding or misnomer would be easy come, easy go. Is that you can try and cover something up real quick, especially online, and you might have covered up for a day or so or a week or so, but if you don't do what's really necessary and what's really required to make it happen, then it won't be a long-term fix.
Yes, completely agree, Stephen. I think that that's something we're seeing this morning as we wake up and we see the ongoing ramifications of CrowdStrike. And as much as the tech has been fixed, now we've got a lawsuit and we've got a new round of headlines. So there's phases of crisis, right? And we're probably going to talk about that today as well. So why don't we start? The word preparation, preparedness, prepare has already come up in a lot of our intros here. And I do want to start at the beginning, which is how you prepare and why preparation is so important. And one of the things I've run into, and Jen and I have talked a little bit about this, is, getting the senior executives, the boards of directors at an organization on board and really, honing in on the importance of being prepared while the crisis is not happening so that when it happens, you can be quick. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, Jen, and sort of how you look at it and how you, think about managing internal stakeholders and getting them on board.
Yeah, of course. So I think in general, when you run a communications team or you're part of a communications team, it's an exercise in helping folks first understand that communications can be really strategic and helpful. So in doing the communications role, figuring out what are the risks to the business. So, we do a lot of listening to think about, okay, what are the issues and topics that could impact our business? That could be, regulatory, that could be news events, it could be a whole host of, challenges, tech challenges, et cetera. And so when you start a role or when you're kind of working on a comms role, to sit down and say, okay, what is the map of the potential risks to our business? And how do we actually take the time to think through at the upfront how we would approach a crisis situation or an issues management situation? I think even the word crisis is pretty loaded, so you probably want to use the word issues. How do you approach an issue as it's kind of coming forth? And small things is figuring out who would be your working group to make quick decisions. What would be your messaging or your holding statement? What would be your communications approach? So for each of the issues that we've identified, we start with this map of, what are the potential issues that we want to manage? And then of those issues, what are what's our comms objective? Who are our key stakeholders that we would need to reach? What are the draft messaging that we can prepare? So as much as we can do in advance, especially working in asset management for a regulated business, so as much as we can do in advance to get kind of pre-compliance approval or pre-legal approval is so helpful. So this way we've kind of got a plan should any of these issues emerge. And if they're not even identical, at least you have a starting place to go back to if something similar does kind of pop up in the future. So I think broadly, I would say preparation is key.
No question. I'd be curious, Stephen, based on what you do, how do you think about it from that digital perspective? Like, what does the preparation look like from I almost want to call it the digital reputation of an organization, because that's really where you specialize. How do you prepare from that perspective?
Sure. So first and foremost, every organization has different sizes, and so we've seen companies that have larger teams and they're able to mobilize much faster because they can just everyone can kind of divvy up their tasks and do what has to be done to prepare. Where we've also dealt with teams that were much smaller, where they needed more time, they needed more of a runway. So in order to make those changes, sometimes they need to step back and understand what it is that they need to get done in order to get to the next step of preparing. Very often we'll lay the groundwork with them to help them understand what they look like in search right away. For example, are they in a position to sustain any sort of negativity? Are they in a position to defend themselves? If anything does show up online, are they in a position to kind of mitigate that quickly? Or is it going to be? Are they going to play a game of catch up when that crisis hits? And so really that's how we look at it. We can assess a situation pretty quickly and understand, where are they relative to their peers? Where are they, relative, if you want to talk Wikipedia, how does the page look? Is it sparse? Is there more content? Is there a way for us to work it in? And there are different ways to come to deal with the crisis. But I think that preparedness, as we've said, is super important, because you just want to be ready for whatever it's going to be when it hits.
Absolutely. So as we think about some of the preparation, and Jen hit a lot on the key parts of a preparation plan, right? I mean, we talked about having the playbook, drafting potential scenario messaging. For me, one of the big things that I think is important is the actual, I call it a simulator, some call it a tabletop, but actually going through the exercises, right? Like taking the time to take a morning with all the internal stakeholders and go through it like it's happening. And then maybe from there having what I call the postmortem, which is where you can then learn and decide, like, we actually have to tweak this playbook. We actually aren't fast enough responding on social, right? Like, I think going through that exercise is really important. The simulator is important. I was curious, and this might be one for you too, Candice. I think an important part of that too is, who's the spokesperson, right? Like how if the execs need to get involved, how do you prep them? To Jen's point earlier, you may have to tweak things, right? So how do you sort of pivot depending on what the actual issue is? And again, I say this coming off of a couple crises we've seen in the news. Obviously, on the CrowdStrike situation, the CEO was the guy. I mean, he was on the Today Show, he was in CNBC. They obviously put him out there. Also, how do you make the decision about who is the face of the crisis? Would love to get perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. Look, I think if we take a step back, even before the issue hits, it's really important to kind of lay the foundation. I think Jen touched a bit on that. So in my experience, an issue can pop up in any part of the organization, right? It can be IT, it can be operational, it can be regulatory, it can be within the business. And one of the biggest parts, I think, in terms of preparing and executives across the firm is to really have strong relationships across the board. So coming into an organization and being able to know your counterparts in legal, in compliance, in technology, in operations, in your C-suite, right? And having a strong relationship with them is super important, because when an issue hits, you kind of have to be able to have those relationships and mobilize and work with them very closely. In terms of figuring out who the spokesperson is, it's going to be different, I think, depending on the issue. And part of having that working group that Jen referenced earlier is to kind of know, in that situation, how do you come to a conclusion quickly on who that person is, and that you can kind of action quickly. I think for various, functions, they're going to have a little bit of a different approach, right? It's going to be a little bit different impact in terms of how we communicate, if it's going to be more operational or technology focused versus something that is more focused on, a senior management issue. So I think it's a case-by-case basis, but having that dialogue, I think, early on, and having that trust as a communications professional and building that early is critical to that.
Absolutely. So when we think about being in the thick of it, to your point, and how this quick decision making requires trust, requires people to move at a very fast pace, I'm curious, we've gone back and forth, all four of us, using the words crisis and issues. I'm curious, within your organizations, how do you think about a crisis versus just an issue? And then also, how do you set the tone when something like this happens internally? Because it is so important to keep everyone focused, but emotions obviously are going to run high. Stephen, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Sure. In our experience, the first thing you do is nothing, even though we said before not to do, that's not what you want to be doing in the long term. But the first thing to do is nothing, because, as you said, when the emotions come into play, people like to jump on their phones fast and tweet or text or WhatsApp or whatever they're doing. And the key really is to hold back, just if it's ever so briefly, until, we set our emotions in check. And we kind of just, okay, how do we react to this? Let's be a little smart. Even if we need to be fast, be slow while you're being fast. Take it, a half a step as opposed to one step at a time, because everything that you say and do, especially online, is going to be recorded. And so you really need to weigh how you're going to react to the situation. It has to be calculated, and typically when emotions run wild, there's very little calculation. So I think it's very, very important to really take that just one step slower, and then the truth is you actually, going back to your first question, is that if you want to talk about crisis versus an issue, you can often tell based on your reaction if it's a real crisis or if it's just an issue, right? If you're reacting in a way which is like ever so, it's an emergency, you feel the urgency, you must get it done right now, it likely is a crisis, right? Obviously, it's very good to bounce things off of your peers, to know what they have to say in the office, or whoever it is your coworkers are, to know, hey, is this a real crisis, or am I dreaming? But at the same time, if it's just an issue, it's like, okay, that can be dealt with, and you usually have the ability to be a little bit more calculated, like off the bat, I would say.
I would just jump in and say, I think one of the hardest parts of the comms role is listening effectively. Listening gives you that perspective. So, we have, just as an example, we have, media monitoring, where we're like kind of looking at not just kind of our clips of Grayscale mentions or our product mentions or our executive mentions. We're also looking at industry trends. Those are like built queries, right? We have very specific queries that we're listening to for real-time monitoring there. And then we also have Amplify, which is a tool that we use for social media listening. I think the benefit of having those tools in place and actually doing the work to set them up is that you can see when there's going to be a spike, right? So if there's a spike, and Stephen, this is probably right, this is more your wheelhouse than mine, but if there's a spike, it's likely coming from social first, so you're going to see it from social first. So having volumetric alerts, for example, allows the comms team to get, oftentimes we're some of the first people to know about a crisis because we have the listening infrastructure set up. So I would say the tools are really important, not only in kind of helping you be aware of an issue emerging or popping up, but also putting that into perspective. So then you actually have the data to say, this is the share of voice of this particular issue. So while it may feel like everything is on fire and, in our small circle, big picture, it's actually not moving the needle amongst, a certain group of, influencers or detractors, for example. So again, having the infrastructure, doing the work to set up those tools allows you to have a more kind of balanced perspective when you're kind of mitigating or working through a particular issue or topic.
Yeah. Agreed, 100%. 100%.
I would also just add, I think in terms of various issues, it's important to contextualize them, right? So when you look at a smaller organization that might not have as much public scrutiny, right? An issue could come through that feels like it's a really big deal. And I think part of the communications function is to kind of give context, I think, in terms of how the public might perceive a particular issue that arises. Whereas in a large organization, you could have many issues all at once in different places, but it's kind of, par for the course in terms of being a large organization with more spotlight. And I think, employees and executives are a little bit more used to that as well, right? So I think having that context for the issue, for the organization you're in, is also important. And I think as a communications professional, part of the role is to help, I think, management and your senior leadership understand that, right? And understand how in the grand scheme of things. And with each issue too, you think about it from a media perspective, you have to look at the context of how it's being reported, right? An issue like CrowdStrike is an industry global issue. It's not, there are some companies that are more impacted than others, but it's something that is touching a lot of different sectors and a lot of different companies. There are some issues that are going to be specific to your company, right? And those are going to be a little bit bigger magnitude. So understanding and analyzing the actual issue in the context of kind of what's happening around the world and for the broader industry is also, I think, really important.
Yeah, a lot of nodding. Couldn't agree more. I think what's interesting too, to tie together Candice, your points, and then what Jen said too about really understanding the conversations, where is share of voice changing, who are the ones that are being noisy and have opinions. That data is helpful because when you think about CrowdStrike, some of the Monday morning quarterbacking I saw on that one, I don't know at what point, the CEO goes on a couple of national broadcasts, to kind of make a statement about what happened. And then all of a sudden you see the criticism light up. Well, he didn't say he was sorry, right? It was all about the apology. And I wonder the overlay of, to your point, Jen, how much intelligence you get from social, right? People are lighting up, like, I'm stranded in an airport, I want an apology, right? And then it came hours later. And then, of course, the crisis professionals like ourselves, saying like, oh, I wonder, what was the decision up front to not throw in the I'm sorry, because it did end up becoming so high impact. And then to Stephen's point, it doesn't go away, right? It lives forever. So whatever that first statement, that first broadcast clip, those live out there. And then you're doing a different type of catch up and crisis mitigation, right? Because you want to get ahead of the narrative and you're already behind it. So interesting to see that. Great points. One of the things I was going to ask, by the way, if you do have the foresight of seeing something coming, right? Because the big thing, CrowdStrike, it just fell. But sometimes you've got an inkling, right? There is a regulatory change. So you're anticipating. And internally, immediately you huddle and think, is there something we can do before this hits? We have 24 hours or we have a week. Be curious some of the best practices you all have in place to get ahead of something when you can, that really can be game changing when it actually does hit, as far as messaging to your stakeholders or whatever the mitigation is.
I mean,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go first.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say, so you need to really assess first and foremost in our case, we assess with the team that we're working with whether they're in a position to mitigate that negativity, right? Whether they're in a position to deal with the change, whether they can push back any negativity that's about to show up. Are they in that position? Kind of going back to really our first question is, are they already prepared to deal with this? Or is it going to be a scenario where it's like, okay, we're going to have to deal with this on the fly, and then maybe we should just own it right away and then kind of move forward from there. There are different scenarios that require different actions, and I think that it also depends on where they feel like moving on to next. Going back to preparedness again, is that if companies or people have plans in place, so then they can decide, where do I want to go? If it's fork in the road, do I want to, go with option A, B, or C, whatever it's going to be, right? If we've prepared. If you haven't prepared, so then you really kind of just have to go with it and say, all right, what do I need to do in order to first calm things down, and then, and then take it from there. And what that really comes down to is what we like to really talk about the most is just taking control of the narrative. And, the question is, what's going to put you in the best position to take control of the narrative? We've seen people or companies deny things online or offline, and that hasn't worked out very well. And at the very moment that anyone in a crisis opens their mouth, they're going to be judged right away on what they say. And so, what needs to be taken into account is, how do I do this in a way where I can take control of the narrative and I don't look at least half as bad as I started off looking, right? And if you bring the conversation over to digital, to online, again, everything's pretty much recorded, unless you want to talk about deleted tweets. But even then, no one forgets. Someone always screenshots that tweet, or someone always finds that comment that was made. And so the point is that you really want to do whatever it is, because that's really what's going on in the background. Those are the thoughts. What do I need to do to take control over the narrative? Someone else started it, but I have to finish it.
Yeah. And I think to further that, I guess, taking again a massive step back, you asked 24 hours in advance. So if I, for example, get a tidbit that, a new regulation is coming out, or a lawsuit is coming, or we have, the very lucky fortune of having 24 hours maybe to respond to a media inquiry, the number one thing I'm doing is I am jumping on a phone call with the working group that we have designated for this particular issue. And we're fact finding. We're saying what's true, what's not true. I think there's often this, like kind of black and white nature when we think about the truth. But the reality is that there's often multiple different truths about a situation, not always, but there can be multiple truths around a situation. So, it can be true that, there is an impact to clients and there is a business reason that there is an impact to clients, right? And so how do we actually parse apart that? So once you kind of figure out what the facts are, then you say, okay, well, we have 24 hours. What's our objective? What are we trying to achieve? What do we want our business to do? And that's when you think about your kind of key audiences, who are the key audiences that you need to reach with, whatever messaging you're going to be developing. And then you begin drafting or tweaking that messaging from the original. And then you say, okay, what kind of pre-approved messaging do we have? What messaging do we need? What collateral do we need? And then what's the channel for distribution of that messaging? I would say that all of this is couched in the fact that sometimes there is no response, right? Sometimes the best thing to do is to pause and to see how that kind of event shakes out. So from that listening perspective, and that's when it comes back to like, how do we measure the conversation? How do we keep a pulse on the conversation? So I would say in general, the number one thing that you have to do is hop on a phone call and make sure that whatever you're doing is aligned to your business's objectives. So this way you're making sure that everything that is being put forth is aligned to those values, those objectives.
Just to add to that point about working group and kind of going back to my earlier point on that is when you have that foundation kind of set up with those relationships, I think it makes it easy to mobilize. But I also think, striking the balance of how many stakeholders to bring in on these issues is also important to think through, because, you can bring in too many and then everybody has a view, too many cooks in the kitchen. And when you're working under tight deadlines, having too many views can also be detrimental in trying to get across the line within that time frame. But having too few views, you might miss something, right? You have to think about your stakeholders, whether it's your clients, regulators, your employees, the public, the press, and think through who needs to be involved with that. So having that, I think, initially thought process of who needs to be brought in, how do we keep it to the number of people that we need who are going to be decision makers at the table here, right? So that you can effectively do that quickly. I would also add that with crisis work and just preparation, there are going to be times where there's going to be a crisis or an issue that pops up that is unanticipated, right? It happens. And having that foundation and, as Jen mentioned, kind of having a call right away, trying to get people together to work that issue and come up with the best solution, whether it is providing a statement, whether it's getting on background, whether it's declining to comment or not responding, all of that, right, is a consensus decision that you make with those stakeholders. But being flexible in your approach is super important as well, and not to be too rigid, because you could have a playbook, but something else comes up and you need to pivot. And I think it's important to maintain that flexibility and think through quickly on your feet if you need to as well.
Such good points. I think particularly what you said about, obviously you need to have the working group and the right internal stakeholders, but if you have too many cooks in the kitchen, not being able to move quickly, which I think we've all established, you do have to move at a pretty rapid pace to get ahead of the narrative. It's interesting because one of the tension points I've seen in crisis communications management has been within working groups, and particularly that tension of moving quickly, but going through legal review. And I know we've all been through it where you've crafted this wonderful message and then all of a sudden the legal team is striking and editing and saying, but do you really want to say that? And I've been watching some of the recent, again, we've had a couple crises that have happened nationally and globally, obviously CrowdStrike. So Delta goes and hires David Boies, a high power attorney, and there's a big lawsuit coming down, right? Would it have changed anything that they said externally? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. Patelco, if you followed that recently, they underwent a cyber attack. They were down for a period of time. They did react pretty quickly, but now I just saw there's a class action, federal and state potential lawsuits as well. So again, the role that, I always wanted my GC, I always want legal there at the table, right? But again, sort of navigating the tension of, does that mean we don't move as fast, but does it mean we avoid a lawsuit later?
Yeah, lawyers are, we went through a federal lawsuit. We proactively sued the government. And I would say that, in that super, high visibility, high stakes sort of an exercise from a comms and public affairs perspective, partnership between legal and comms is absolutely critical. the legal team. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember you all have the same objective, and it's to, promote and protect the brand that you work for and your company that you work for. So, understanding that you're on the same team and, taking a beat where you need to take a beat. I mean, this is where it goes back to Candice's points. Like, if you have the relationship, you can call your GC or your chief legal officer and be like, we need to boogie on this. Like, we need to prioritize this. So it's like, it's a very human, like, we're talking about this like it's a playbook, but at the end of the day, communications is so largely instinct, and like everybody is human. So having those relationships is so, so important, especially in moments that can be tense or high pressure.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've talked about different channels and different mediums for getting the message out. And I think today it's just becoming increasingly important. Just the other day, I made a comment that we live in a video and memes world. And I think about, I started Crisis 120 years ago, and the channel was really just traditional media, right? I mean, it was pre-social. There weren't a lot of options. And, you went direct, through email, or you leverage traditional media. There's just a lot of options today. And it's a double-edged sword, right? You have a lot of options. So if you know your audience as well, you can pick the right ones. But then it can become overwhelming because it's like, well, what am I doing on social? What am I doing on my website? And what social channels? What reporters am I going to talk to, right? And it just becomes this an interesting challenge out of the gate. I mentioned CrowdStrike. They chose CNBC and Today. Huge impact. They wanted to get to both, I think, businesses and consumers quickly with their message. But I'd love to hear from all of you sort of how you make that medium, decision, and what information you use. Jen, you touched a little bit on it earlier, like you're listening, right? So deciding who the big stakeholders are and how to go after the ones that are agitating or that you're hearing from the most. But we'd love to get the behind the scenes on how you make those decisions.
Okay, I guess I'll go first on this one.
I went first on the last one, so I was giving someone a chance.
Yeah, so we look at things. We look at things in the eyes of typically of the search results of the algorithm and the way that search engines like to prioritize different mediums. Even though going back to what Jen said is that there are lots of ways to listen and lots of ways to gauge a reputation and understand what people are thinking. It really is critical to understand where the most important people are looking when they're thinking about your brand, right? And that is specifically why we do focus on in the areas that we're focusing on, for example, in search and Wikipedia, because when you're talking about corporate in particular, social media is nice and dandy, but in the end of the day, they're not necessarily sitting on there all day. The important people for your business are not necessarily on social all day. They're kind of busy, and things do come up and they do search. And I would say they do that. They look at that more often than not, as opposed to other mediums. And through the eyes of search, what you'll find is that Google and most search engines like to categorize different mediums when it comes to appearing in search. So, for example, you'll have video, right? And then you'll also have your own written articles, or you'll have some sort of interview, whether it's going to be done by CNBC in that case, or it's going to be done by Bloomberg or whatever it's going to be. And it's important to position yourself in a way where, going back to, again, really controlling the narrative as much as possible. Who can you work with that's going to give you the highest degree of control, right? So for a company, if they have their own YouTube channel, for example, it will be very helpful for them to have some sort of Q&A with their CEO on the issue at hand or whatever it's going to be. If they have a good relationship with Bloomberg, you have a situation where Bloomberg can have some sort of an interview, and then, just to give you an example, Bloomberg will often tweet out their videos afterwards, right? And so then that video will end up showing up both in a tweet and both in the video container, for example, of search results. And so there are a number of different mediums to use, but to be honest, if you split it up by industry, we have data that shows that even certain industries will show different types of mediums than others. Some websites, for example, will appear way more often in search results for a company in finance as opposed to a company that's, in manufacturing or whatever it may be. So, in real estate, there are specific sites who are in real estate, and they have some videos on their site, and those videos are going to show up even more than a Bloomberg video, possibly, depending on who you're talking about it and what level they're at. So, you definitely want to. It is somewhat customizable, and that's why it's always good to take a look back at things through a different lens, whether it's going to be through the industry or based on the executive, based on the person, based on what type of what they're doing, and you really can view things that way. But at the end of the day, to answer you is the different mediums are important. You just need to know where your audience is and what's important to them. And again, in our case, we talk about search because that's just what we feel is the most important for our clients.
I mean, I would just add that I think it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And each issue is going to have a little bit of a different strategy in terms of how you communicate. I think a lot of times on the corporate level, social can be a way to amplify, but it can also what's already out there in terms of if you have coverage from a third-party media outlet or if you have a press release or a statement that you've issued. But it can also be a way for you to own your own message, right? If you're not feeling that third parties are getting the message out there in the way that you want, having your own content is another channel for you to be able to do that. And it's really thinking through the particular issue and what makes sense given the circumstances that you have, whether it's more of an amplification tool, whether it's something where you're leading with for your own channels first. And, to Stephen's earlier point about sort of knowing your audience, right? Also, where are the key stakeholders in the particular issue that you're dealing with? That will also help dictate how you devise your strategy in terms of what channel you pull and you start with and lead with in that particular matter.
Yeah. We start every kind of conversation around distribution with actually a core messaging document where we kind of agree with legal and compliance on a high level set of messages. Those are the messages that our executives speak to, that our content gets written from, that we give out to kind of third party advocates. So I would say having a high level core messaging document that is like your starter. And then I think about kind of channels through 3 buckets: owned, earned, and paid. So for me, owned is, anything that you put out on your social channels, blogs, press releases, etc. Earned is media, but also I think third-party advocates, having kind of folks who understand your business, who can kind of speak to the issue or the topic at hand. And then paid, I mean, those are the sponsored ads, those are the, event appearances, etc. So for us, it's that 360-degree approach. So if you're going to do something, to Candice's point, how do you actually amplify that across all of your channels to maximize the impact of that one thing to all of your kind of key stakeholders?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about, once you've identified the channels that reach the key stakeholders, it's interesting to think about, and I think I've talked with you all about what happened with Silicon Valley Bank last year, because, looking back, it spiraled really quickly. And one of the contributors, from what I've read, was the customers of the bank were Silicon Valley, right? They were in the tech community, and they all knew each other. So while, it was questionable how quickly, if the bank reacted quickly enough, if they were using social enough, did they get the right messages out there? But that constituency, their customers that had deposits in the bank, they were all talking to each other, right? They were all in each other's contact book. So they're calling each other as rumors start to flow. And then you have to think about, well, what's the next level of how I get to the stakeholder? Like, who are the influencers that influence that stakeholder besides Jen, to the point of all the channels we just talked about across Peso, and can I get to them, right? Because, people are impacted by their community and their group and what their neighbor says and their trusted confidant says. And I think a lot happened in a channel, which was customer to customer direct, that they couldn't break through, or maybe they could have, but that's quite a challenging situation to be in. And I know, Jen, you and I have talked to you about the importance of stakeholder mapping as well, and thinking about, if you want to talk a bit about that, but when you map them, then listing all the influencers for those stakeholders, of which can you get to, and maybe there's some that you can't.
Yeah, I mean, for us, stakeholder mapping is a really important exercise. We do it across the analysts that cover our business. We do it across the reporters who cover our business, the social media folks, and we basically give them an NPS, like a Net Promoter Score. Are they positive? Are they neutral? Are they detractors? And then we can have kind of thoughtful conversations about, okay, well, here's their kind of sphere of influence. Are they worth putting the effort in to neutralize? Or are we better suited putting our efforts towards someone who's neutral and trying to make them super bullish? This is a super time intensive exercise, and it's something that's kind of ever changing. So, I think that one of the benefits of the listening apparatus is that we have set up is that we're able to kind of listen to those folks, on a kind of regular basis. And I think one of the beauties of being kind of comms professionals is that we have the ability to develop real relationships with those people. And so, keeping a pulse on them, doing a regular check-in on what that stakeholder map looks like allows you to have that like thoughtful and strategic conversation. But it also, in a moment of, where an issue is popping up or a crisis is popping up, if you have a genuine relationship with folks on the stakeholder mapping list, you can reach out to them just to give them kind of background on, what's happening or what's underway.
And we're going to open it up in just a couple minutes for QA. So before we do that, I have so many more questions for this group, but one I wanted to touch on, because we've shared a lot of perspective and best practices. Curious from all of you, what are mistakes you've seen, made, maybe you've made, you don't have to say if it was you, that you would recommend people avoid? Like what's the tough lesson you've learned or you've seen someone else learn that you would want to share?
I'm happy to start. I think that in general, indecision is a big mistake. Unfortunately, with most crises that come up, there's not a lot of time to act, right? And so you hopefully have a playbook, you have something prepared. And again, as I mentioned, you kind of have to be flexible with that too. But it's easy to fall into the trap of being kind of a bit paralyzed, right? Given the issue, given the stress related to what's happening and the ability to have to move very quickly. So I think it's always important to stay calm, to really engage your internal stakeholders and really come and analyze the situation to come to the best decision for the firm. And that, again, includes various viewpoints, making sure the working group isn't too big, but the right size where you're going to make that decision. And again, it can be a number of outcomes, right, in terms of what you actually decide to do. And sometimes it's not commenting, as Jen mentioned earlier. But I think that analysis and making sure that you're thorough in it and coming to the best decision is important. And being able to kind of not be too paralyzed by the situation, I think is critical.
Yeah. I would say, just to kind of pull on that, I would say Candice mentioned this earlier, but the ability to be nimble. I mean, I think one of the kind of biggest challenges that I've seen is that we kind of overlean on precedent or what's been done before. And Amber, to your point, we're living in a very different world, and we have new technology emerging, like with AI, which present new types of challenges and new types of opportunities. So it's really important to kind of take in and understand kind of best practice and what's been done before at your company and outside of your company, but not being willing to experiment or to pilot, maybe not in a crisis situation, but not being willing to, or being prepared to evolve, I think it has been a downfall of a lot of kind of companies and communications functions that I've seen over the course of my career.
Yeah, I would actually add on as well. I know it's been mentioned before, but not doing anything at all is going to be a real issue. It's been the biggest issue that I've seen, and for at least from our perspective, because we're not dealing as much with creating the statements or coming out with any statements. There's a lot of work that can be done in the background on the digital side, right before a crisis hits or when the crisis hits, that you don't necessarily look like you're doing anything on the outside. However, there's a tremendous amount that will be done. It will make a huge impact on the search results or Wikipedia or wherever it's going to be that you're looking at. And it just may take a little time for that to settle in, but really freezing and not doing anything at all, at least, especially from the digital side, is just a huge mistake, because it's just, like I said originally, is that, it's not going to go away by itself. So even if you're doing something in the background, that's really going to take care of a lot of the issue, or at least lay the groundwork to start taking care of that issue as things move forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, Stephen. And this might be a question for you to kick us off with, which is measurement. So when the crisis is through, right? And, I always say you move right from crisis into reputation management mode. And in between, there's a post-mortem, of course. What are the metrics for success, right? I mean, how can you measure? And obviously, it's dependent on the crisis, but do you have any tips on measuring then over time? Did you protect the brand? How you rebuild the brand? What are your tricks? And again, I'm open to anyone, but maybe we'll start with you, Stephen.
Sure. The way that I would suggest is really to have some sort of tool set in place. As Jen had mentioned earlier, the tools that are important for you are going to be the best ones to use. So whether you're very sensitive about social and you want to listen there, that's going to be very important. And you can see over time what's happening. Different tools, I know that they have different options of showing you what's changed over time. We particularly have our own platform that we use, where we can track search results, and we see where the negative results are across time. And you can see literally like a chart, if an unfavorable or negative search result, or an article, or wherever it's going to be, maybe it started off appearing at the top of results, maybe it was number 3, number 4, number 5, and over time you see it go down. It's a very clear way to gauge success in that case. Wikipedia is a little bit of a separate discussion, but Wikipedia as well, you can see, I guess from the just your eye or anyone's eye, you can see if something sticks out, or or how it was worded. Was it worded the right way? Does it give the right story? Does it give your story? So it's a little bit subjective in that case on the Wikipedia side, but there are ways to definitely gauge with the right tools, depending on where it is that you'd like to look.
So we did have a question come in. I'm looking at the Q&A. Speaking of social listening, Stephen, and this is for everyone too, a question about which tools we use or prefer on the social listening side.
I love this question. This was literally the first thing I came when I came over to Grayscale. One of the first things I said was we need a social listening tool. So we now use a combination. So we use Amplify, EMPLIFI. I would say it's a challenger to Sprinkler, which was a tool that I had used long over my career, which is another one, depending on your budget. Then there's TweetDeck and other social tools that are free if you're looking for some free tools. I would say for us, again, if you have a budget for it, I think a Wikipedia agency is really important, and Stephen didn't tell me to say that, but if you don't know how to use Wikipedia, there's a lot of weird editorial quirks. So having an agency that can help you navigate that editorial process is really helpful. And then if you have a traditional kind of PR or comms agency, asking them to tune into social topics or a specific list of influencers as part of their real-time monitoring may be something that they can do as well. But a combination of Amplify, Google Alerts, those sort of things for me have been, it's a healthy channel mix for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think just the online presence of a firm is just so much more important than it was, right, even a decade ago in terms of what people search, what the first thing that they look at. And I think you're also seeing an increase in people, bad actors in the space of like creating fake accounts, right, or trying to damage the reputation of individuals or firms. So having kind of, I think, a thorough kind of thought process around that, preparing or rather kind of protecting your reputation is super important on the digital side, just given the world that we live in today. So I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with everyone here. I think that that's pretty much the right perspective. Whether it's the tools or it's looking at the executives or whatever it may be, that's definitely on the mark.
Yeah, one of the tools I've leaned on, so earlier this year, I helped a client through a ransomware attack. So it was several weeks of their business being down, very, very strategic and careful communications, because you have a threat actor who's also watching your communications while attacking your system. So it was a very intricate process to get through. Unsurprisingly, a lot of media who weren't following the company certainly were, because they were following cybersecurity issues. They were curious about the threat actor, the ransomware, and all of the details. So coming off and we're fully in recovery phase, back up and running, we're using Signal, which is our tool for traditional media, to really follow sentiment. Because it's been very important for us to move the needle back to neutral and positive coverage, and also shake out any of the negative coverage. As you can imagine, these things linger. When your company is covered, oftentimes video will dynamic. We recently suffered a cyber attack, even if the story is not about that, right? So we're measuring how much we can move away from that narrative over time, get focused back on all the good things the company is doing, etc. So that's been another helpful tool for us on the traditional side. It's also great for service. Okay, now we're going the last couple minutes. I'm going to scroll through any additional Q&A from the audience. Okay, so someone's asked, going back to decision making, often declining to comment is the best route. How do your teams get to that decision of not commenting?
I'm happy to take that one. It's really case by case basis, right? You have to kind of think through the particular issue and sort of what stakeholder you're dealing with, right? Sometimes if it's related to a regulatory issue, there can be sensitivities about what you say on the record, right? So having that legal team or the litigation team, with you in terms of thinking through the potential messaging or what you want to say is important. The other things that I often look at is sort of speaking to the journalist and thinking through what is the broader piece about, right? Is it about us specifically? Is it about, we're one of many firms mentioned, right? Those are some of the considerations that I would think through to advise on the best response, and whether that's decline to comment or not. If the situation is also evolving very quickly, right, and what you say now could be different from what you say 5 hours from now, you might pause and think, do we want to say something right now, right? So these are just some kind of high level, things that I would consider when thinking through that.
Totally agree on all of that. I would say the other thing is that when we're kind of working through our preparation activities, is we have like different go or no go topics. Like there are just certain things that we know we're not going to comment on. And it's helpful to kind of have that alignment up front in your scenario planning exercises. So if you're going through an exercise, for example, around the election, like is your leadership team going to want to comment on partisan politics? That is something that, I would say a lot of companies are grappling with right now. And if you are going to comment on politics, what is the framing by which that commentary has to be given? So again, having those relationships, having those scenario planning exercises, when you do your scenario planning, figuring out what are the go, no-go topics, helps when you're getting ready to kind of decide whether or not to comment, because if you have that baseline, you can then as the comms professional say, I know we had during scenario planning X meeting, a conversation where we decided that we were not going to comment on this issue. Here's what the reporter's working on. Here's what they're asking us for. My recommendation is to kind of keep a no comment approach. Does anyone feel strongly otherwise? And then again, you can do that quite quickly because you've done the work to prepare to be able to make that decision. Whereas if it's something that you have decided that you've already commented on, then you can say, this is a topic that we said we were going to comment on. Are you all in agreement that I'm going to work with X executive to get something drafted and over to legal within the next hour or two?
Whether deciding to to say something or make a statement or not, I would leave to the communications professionals. But what I would say is that if they do choose to say something, it would be best to do it on your own channels, as opposed to getting interviewed somewhere or being written in some article, wherever it may be. Because here, at the very least, you have the control over that whatever it is that you're going to say, or that narrative, and you can make any changes you want, or you can take it down, or whatever it may be. But again, it's in your control, and so therefore you can do what you want with it at any point in time.
Absolutely. I know we're going to run out of time and try to squeeze one more. And we had another question come in about a media statement that is attributed to your name or a spokesperson versus according to a company spokesperson, and how you make the statement. This came in for Candice, not to put you on the spot. Anyone can answer, but how you decide attribution, Candice.
Sure. So I think that it's often actually the publication and the reporter and the nature of the story that often determines how that gets written up. From my perspective, I typically like to just issue a statement. I'm a spokesperson for the company, right? So it's coming from the company, and it can be written up in different ways, right? Some reporters will say a company spokesperson. Some people will say, the company said XYZ, right? And just attribute it directly. From my experience, when they use your name, it often is because the story is a little bit more contentious. They want to name the spokesperson because it's a bigger issue, it's a bigger story. And then there are some media outlets that have rules, right? Some media outlets will say we have to name a spokesperson, right? And some will say that based on the specific story that you're working with them on. So, I think it's really dictated more by the nature of the story, the publication, sometimes even the specific reporters. I've had experiences where different reporters at the same publication will have different, rules about how they implement that policy. But from my perspective, it's about the company's statement, right? Like, you are an official spokesperson for the company, and that's how I typically, would manage those kind of statements.
Thank you, Candice. That's really helpful. I know we have less than a minute now, so we are going to wrap up. Thank you so much. I love the questions coming in. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we tried. Maybe we can have a part 2, Ashley.
Part 2 sounds good. It seems like there's some demand for it. Lots of conversation happening here. Thank you, everybody.